Last night, most of you probably remember the story that I told you about a pig in the airplane. It's kind of a funny story, except for at the time that it happened, it almost cost me my life. It was something that with a little more foresight could have been avoided. Tonight I'm going to tell you another story about another flight that I made. This time, my foresight and planning had nothing to do with the outcome. For many years we had been running a fishing operation in southeastern Colombia. I had designed and built a cold storage facility. The native fishermen would catch fish, we would freeze them, fly them to market, and this was how we supported our air operation. We were able to fly missionaries free of charge through the jungle. Well, as the Marxist guerrillas grew stronger in Colombia, they moved into our area, and we became one of their first targets. Just because we were Americans, because we were missionaries. They shot up our fish operation. We were forced to close it down, putting about 250 fishermen on the river out of work, some of whom were Christians. It was giving them a decent opportunity to make a living. The only other alternative in that particular area was cultivating cocaine or marijuana. I felt bad about this, and so I decided to try and reorganize the fishing enterprise as a cooperative. And a meeting was set up for me to go to a small town on the invitation of the town council and speak with the fishermen and with some businessmen and try and set this up. And I flew out there, but unfortunately, the president of the town council had a different type of business deal in mind, namely a kidnapping. He had a squad of Marxist guerrillas waiting for me when I climbed out of the airplane. They pointed their machine guns at me, and they marched me out of town a captive. It was rather a jolt for me. I can still remember walking down that road, and it seemed like it wasn't real. They took me into the jungle, and one of them told me in a harsh voice to lay down on my stomach. I thought, oh boy, they just wanted to get me out of town before they killed me. They didn't want to do it in front of too many witnesses. I looked at him, and he repeated his order. I said, well, I guess I'll just have to trust you. And I lay down, expecting to get shot through the back of the head. Well, it turned out all he wanted to do was tie me up with a nylon rope. He put a loop of the rope around my neck, and another loop with a twist in it around each of my arms. It was all hooked into a central slip knot in my back. And if he pulled on the line, everything came tight. I would get choked, and my arms would get jerked back like this. As long as the line was slack, I could move and I could walk. And he proceeded to herd me into the jungle, holding the end of the line, and two other men flanking us on the sides, holding their guns on me. We arrived at the riverbank, where we saw some more guerrillas, a big pile of equipment. About 60 men had taken part in the kidnapping. They'd closed off the whole town just to get me. And one of them walked forward, he looked at me and he said, I'm the leader. We're kidnapping you to raise money for our cause. He was a very thorough, methodical type of person. And he looked me square in the eye and he asked me a question. He said, do you have a weapon? And I looked him back square in the eye and I said, no, I don't have a weapon. It wasn't really the truth, though, because I had a little ace in the hole. I had a little revolver strapped onto my left ankle. Over the years of jungle flying, I had taken to the habit of carrying a firearm in the airplane for survival purposes. After the pig incident, I kind of saw the need to have one for other purposes also. I had this little Smith & Wesson 5-shot 38 in a little leg holster right here. Well, as we were talking, one of the guerrillas came up with my flight bag. He'd been going through it, and he found a pocket full of, or a handful of 38 shells in there. He came forward with those cartridges in his hand, and he just demanded to know where the gun was. And my heart sank. At that moment, I figured I could probably get out of the kidnapping. Sooner or later, I'd get to use my little gun, and I thought, boy, will they ever wish they'd never kidnapped me. I had another problem. My pant leg was a little too short. There was about an inch of gun barrel sticking out the bottom. And I tried to think up a story that they would buy about why I didn't have a gun. And my heart just started going hippity-hop inside. In another minute, I knew they'd search me good. So I racked my brain trying to think of what to say. And at that precise instant, the nurse to the guerrilla outfit came up with a stethoscope and a blood pressure cuff, of all things, and decided to take my blood pressure and listen to my heart. They all try and be real professional at their job, and so this was her way of showing off. But I had the faint impression that maybe they might have kidnapped someone in previous weeks or months, and that person might have died of a heart attack, maybe of being too scared. And so they weren't taking any chances with me. They were going to check me out good. Well, a thought crossed my mind, and I said to him, you know, I have this heart condition that comes and goes, and you're putting too much strain on me. If you just back off a little bit, maybe I'd be okay. She was listening, and boy, did she ever have she had a real funny look on her face as she listened to my heart. It really was thumping. And she waved him back and sat me down on a log, got me a drink of water, and the rest of the men finished loading their equipment into a large dugout canoe that they had. A few minutes later, she came back and asked me how I was. And I said, oh, my heart condition is improving nicely. Well, they put me in a rain poncho. On my head, Fidel Castro-style military cap, so that no one would recognize me as we traveled upriver. They loaded me into the boat with 8 of them, and away we went. Another boatload followed. We journeyed for about an hour. As we went upriver, we were coming to a bend on which our family farm and fishing enterprise was located. So I was practically right in my own backyard. When coming around the bend downriver was a speedboat that they thought was the police. So quickly they beached the boat in a banana patch right across the river from our house. One of them took me back into the back of the bushes and told me to crouch down. And the rest of them set up an ambush for the policemen. They were going to kill the police. I can remember sitting back down in those bushes, or crouched down, and I thought, this is as good of a chance as I'm going to get to escape. And then I thought, I'd hate to just sit here and watch those policemen get killed. Maybe I should do something to disrupt this ambush. And I thought, what? Here was a guard about 10 feet away from me with his machine gun pointed right at my stomach, his finger on the trigger. I knew better than to pull out my little gun and point it at him and say, you know, hands up or something stupid. So I thought, well, maybe if I do a real quick draw here, maybe I can shoot him in the arm. And if I do, then his arm won't work and he won't be able to pull the trigger. And maybe I can get away. And the policeman will hear the shot and they won't walk into an ambush. Well, for a split-second plan, it was pretty good, but in actual practice, it worked a little different. I waited till the guard turned his head to watch his buddies on the riverbank, and then I drew. And he caught the motion out of the corner of his eye, and as I drew and whipped that gun up from under that rain poncho, he lunged to one side. He lunged forward and this way. And the bullet, instead of going through his shoulder, I took just enough time to get a good sight picture. It went right through the top, the right side of his chest. Second problem was that it wasn't a normal bullet. It was a hollow point. And it did quite a bit of damage. In fact, it blew him right over backwards. And I figured that when I shot him, he'd probably drop the other end of the rope that was tied in a slip knot around my neck. But he didn't. He gave a mighty heave on it with his good hand as he was going over backwards. And the whole thing whipped shut, went tight across my neck with almost enough force to break it. Took the skin off all the way around. It wasn't a thick line, it was a very light line, but it was too heavy to break. Fortunately, in the way the slip knot was set up, the first slip knot was around my arm instead of around my neck. And it cut in pretty bad into my armpit. And the second one tightened around my neck, which if it would have been the other way around, it would have probably broken my neck. But here I was trying to figure out how to breathe. He managed to get a hold of his gun again in his left hand, and he was trying to shoot me with it, writhing around on the ground. I found out that the rope was tangled in the gun barrel, and that by putting some tension this way on the rope, I could make the gun barrel miss me, so he couldn't shoot me. But as long as I kept that much tension on the rope, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't get any slack in the knot. It was around my neck. So it was a Mexican standoff with me on the losing side, running out of air fast. So I took the gun and I tried to shoot the rope in two. Then I got a little more desperate and I started shooting at his hand. And finally I realized that I was losing precious time and that his buddies were going to quickly find out and close in on me. And I lunged to one side and took a shot right at his head. I figured I better kill him and I better get out of there. By this time, blood was splattered all over the place. And I had never used a gun against a human being. I'd done a lot of hunting, but it just really rattled me. It wasn't the same at all. About this time, one of his buddies figured out what was going on and ran over, and from about, I guess about 25 yards away, he popped up out of the bushes, aimed his German G3 assault rifle right at me. I remember looking right down the barrel, and then he pulled the trigger. And his gun went click. And misfired. And I can remember bringing my gun up and sighting right on his chest and pulling the trigger, and mine went click. My 5 shots were gone. To this day, I still remember shooting only 4 times, but it must have been 5. Well, he dove behind a log when he saw my gun, and I turned around and hit the end of the rope as hard as I could, trying to either snap it or jerk it out of the grasp of this guy that was still dying, clutching onto it. It didn't break. He didn't let go. It was tangled in his gun barrel. The gun was around him in a sling. I dragged him through the woods a little ways and managed to make it to a clump of banana trees and threw myself down behind them. I can remember clawing frantically in my pocket, trying to get some more ammunition. Wouldn't you know, I had a bunch of 20-gauge shotgun shells and my wallet and everything under the sun on the top of the pocket. I couldn't get anything out. And I knew they were going to start shooting at me. I could hear the guy racking the bolt of his automatic weapon, getting a new round in the chamber. I knew those banana trees weren't going to stop the bullets either. I knew I was going to die. This was it, you know. And I thought, what an awful way to go. What a shame. There's all kinds of things I'd rather I'd like to do with my life. I'm not done living. And that was it. The only thing I could do was just lower my head and wait for the end. I was literally at the end of my rope. And all of a sudden, the guerrilla leader called out from directly behind me. And he said, "Throw down your weapon." Which I did. It was empty. Two of them came forward and they jerked me to my feet. They were rather upset, just putting it mildly. The guy on the ground was still struggling with his weapon, trying to shoot it. The leader walked over and took it away from him, which I was relieved to see. Then he turned to me and he said, "Why did you do this?" And I thought, yeah, it's a good question. Why did I do it? Turned out the guys coming down the river weren't the police. They were somebody else in a boat that looked like the police boat. They almost shot them, but they didn't. Well, as I racked my brain for an answer, I knew that my life was hanging by a thread. These guerrillas respect courage, valor, very little else. I know if I said, "Don't shoot me, that was exactly what they were going to do. So I looked at him and I said, "Well, put yourself in my spot. What would you do if you were captured by an enemy? If you had a weapon and a chance to use it to escape, would you?" And he thought for a minute and he looked at me and he said, "Yeah." He said, "I would have done the same thing you did." Then he turned to the guy I had shot. And I still don't know how this happened, but the shot that I aimed at the guy's head never took effect. The one that went through the chest had blown out most of the top of his right lung, and he was in bad shape, but he was still alive. Here the guy's laying there bleeding, possibly dying, and the leader starts to bawl him out. He says, "This is your fault. You didn't search the prisoner properly like I told you to in the first place. This is what you get for not obeying your orders." Guerrillas are trained that if they obey their orders to the letter, that they'll never die or even be wounded in combat. It's ingrained and drilled into them every day. Well, they loaded us both back in the boat. This time they tied me up real good. They threw me in the bottom of the boat. I landed on top of a bent kneel. There was water in the bottom of the boat. They threw a tarp on top of me. Like they didn't really care too much about me anymore. And off we went. I remember there was a hole in the tarp. And as I looked out that hole, I could see just a little bit. The only thing that I could see was the face of Manuel, the guerrilla I had just shot. Manuel's lips were white. He'd lost quite a bit of blood. I'd had quite a bit of experience with gunshot wounds, done a lot of air ambulance flying. And I figured Manuel would live about 3 hours. And I figured that as soon as Manuel died, they'd start torturing me. They'd probably hang me by my heels over an ant nest for a day or two before they finally killed me, before they let the ants do it. And I thought, oh man, I am really in a mess. And the worst thing I thought is that in a few hours or days, both Manuel and I are going to be standing before the Lord, and we're both going to have to explain this whole mess. What are we going to say? There I went and shot and killed a guy, and it served no useful purpose whatsoever. I can't think of what I'm going to say. And that was when I started praying. I prayed and I asked God to let Manuel live and to let me live too. And that we both might be able to learn whatever lesson God had for us in this whole experience. Well, we arrived at our destination in 3 hours, and the guerrillas had a field hospital. They operated on Manuel, and the nurse came out and said it's going to be okay, he's going to live. The bullet had gone completely through the body, lodged on top of the opposite kidney without breaking a bone. And they were able to repair the damage. They pulled out that bullet, and it was about the size of a 50-cent piece. Just opened up like the petals of a flower. And the tension kind of eased a little bit, and we marched for the rest of the night. We got to a spot in the jungle where the guerrillas made a semi-permanent camp, and that's where we stayed for the next 3 weeks. I can remember sitting in the hammock that the guerrillas hung for me. A hammock with a mosquito net, a sheet. I was tied up, 3 guards. I remember sitting there, and I was a little bit upset. In fact, I was even a little upset with God. I can remember praying and saying to the Lord, how come you let this happen to me? I said to him, you know, why didn't you help me a little bit when I was trying to escape? If you would have just helped me not get tangled up in that rope, I would have been gone. I would have got away. It was bitter. I said to the Lord, whose side are you on anyway? Why would you not help me when I'm in such a difficult spot? And I sat there for several days, and I got more and more depressed. But after a few days, all of a sudden the Lord started working with me inside, started teaching me some things. I began to feel conviction inside that maybe I hadn't handled the situation in the best manner. I began to feel convicted, especially about the lie that I told the guerrillas about the gun in the first place. It was almost as if I could hear God hypothetically in my mind trying to ask me a question. And the question that kept popping into my mind was, what conclusion would you have drawn if you would have gotten away from the guerrillas? Well, then I would have been a big hero. I would have been the guy who outsmarted and outshot the guerrillas. And I would have come to the conclusion that, yeah, when you're in a tight spot, you might have to tow a lie or two. It might be necessary. And that would have been wrong. The Lord began to impress on me the way in which that guerrilla camp was being run. The whole business was based on lies, one lie after another. Starting with the lie that God does not exist. That's the premise that they start with. The next one is the end justifies the means. And those are the 2 cornerstones to Marxist theology. I looked around that guerrilla camp, and everything was just one lie after another. The men couldn't even trust one another. And I thought, man, I'm supposed to be a Christian. If I run around telling lies too, where does that put me? Almost in the same boat with them. I thought that over for a day. Then I prayed again to the Lord and I said, you know, I think I've learned an important lesson here. I think that I've learned that as a Christian I can't descend to using the enemy's methods or means no matter what. I said to the Lord, you know, now that I've learned such an important lesson, why don't you please help me get out of here? I'd like to go home to my wife and daughter. And I can't think of any more reason for me to stick around this guerrilla camp. I said to the Lord, you know, I know it would have been nice for you to have me in here as a missionary. to tell these guerrillas about you. That's probably what you had in mind, but I've blown it so bad that this is hopeless. How can I tell them Christian message now when I started out with a bunch of lies, then I pulled a gun and shot one of them? That's really a great start as a missionary in this guerrilla camp. What could I possibly say now that would do any good? So this has been a beneficial experience. And next time something like this happens, well, I'll try and get my act together. Maybe we can do it right next time. And then I just pleaded with God. I said, please get me out of here. But it turned out that God was just beginning to work with me in that guerrilla camp. He wanted to teach me another important lesson. That lesson was that I didn't have to be perfect to be used of God. All I had to be was honest. And as I was willing to admit my mistakes and my failures, it turned out that God specializes in taking our biggest mistakes and human failures and turning them into something good for Him. I remember laying in my hammock the next night and thinking this all over. Then after several weeks, who should walk back into camp but Manuel, the guy I had shot. He walked over and he just glared at me. He wasn't very happy with me. His left hand fingered the butt of a 9mm pistol stuck down the back of his pants, and I got the picture. He wanted to pay me back in the worst way. The other guerrilla said, yeah, old Manuel will be back on guard duty before you know it. When you're alone with him at night, well, I'm sure you'll have a lot of interesting things to talk about. Old Manuel has a lot on his mind, you know. I thought, oh boy, he'll shoot me and tell the others I tried to escape even if I didn't. And these guerrillas start to bear a grudge, they really do it. Oh no, I'm going to have to escape. I'm going to have to get out of here. We're 60 miles from home with no supplies, not even a knife, no matches, nothing. How am I going to get through 60 miles of jungle even if I break out of this guerrilla camp? I began to worry. That night, I said to the Lord in my prayers, you know, if you really want to use me in this guerrilla camp, I'd sure like to know. I'd like to know if I'm supposed to just sit here, if I'm supposed to try and escape. I need to have some guidance here as to what to do. I prayed and I said to the Lord, you know, if I'm supposed to stay in this guerrilla camp, if that's where you want me, it sure would be nice if something would happen around here to cheer me up a little bit. I said, you know, the thing that I would really appreciate would be if you could change Manuel's attitude. If Manuel quit glaring at me and quit fingering his pistol, I'd feel a lot safer around here. That was what I prayed to the Lord. I was so upset about this whole thing that I think I spent the rest of the night praying about Manuel. I didn't sleep. I said to the Lord, you know, if you intervene and if you do change Manuel's attitude, I'd like to be able to shake his hand. If I could shake his hand, I'd know that that grudge was gone. That's what I would like. The next afternoon, Manuel came back into camp. And he walked over to where I was, and he sat down, and he started to talk. And he had a different attitude. And he said, you know, I was the only one in this guerrilla band who was against kidnapping you in the first place. I tried to talk him out of it, he said. But this is a military organization, and I have to obey my orders. If I don't, I'll get killed for insubordination. He said, here I was the one who got injured by you and almost killed. And so I began to talk to Manuel. And I said, well, don't take it personally, Manuel. I said, you are standing between me and freedom. And I felt that having that gun, and with that impending ambush that you folks are setting up, that I had to do something. I couldn't have lived with myself otherwise. But I said, I think I made a big mistake. And I told him about the lie. And how I felt that as a Christian, I shouldn't be telling lies. Then I told him why I was in Colombia in the first place, about some of our missionary work, and some other things. And I presented the gospel to him as best as I could. And 3 hours later, when he stood up to go, he held out his hand to me. The same side that I'd shot him on was so stiff he could hardly move his arm. And he got a hold of my hand. With his good arm, he put it around my shoulder. And he said in Spanish, "Tranquilo, no pasó nada." That means it's okay, there's nothing between us. And boy, did I ever feel happy as I saw Manuel turn and walk away. That was a turning point for my captivity. From then on, I was able to look at that kidnapping as an opportunity to reflect some of Jesus' love and mercy to those guerrillas. My thinking changed. I quit feeling sorry for myself. And I started writing a book. Wrote it about the guerrillas and about myself, and explained why I was there. I presented the gospel as best I could, and I dedicated it to Manuel. And I sent it to him. Manuel read the book and he liked it. And he spent his time taking it around and having all his buddies read it. And he was in guerrilla headquarters. And there were 600 and some men in that camp. And later, when I was transferred there, I found that most of the guerrillas had read my book. And that I was a celebrity. I was the guy who wrote the book. I was the guy who shot Manuel. And the Lord was able to take one of the biggest mistakes that I have ever made in my life and turn it into something good. He was able to form a bond of friendship between Manuel and myself. In the book, I use Manuel as the example of how Jesus' message on love and mercy was supposed to work. I presented the gospel to them out of Jesus' Beatitudes. And you might think that's a strange message. You know, it starts out and Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That doesn't sound like a verse on salvation, but think about it. In Spanish, that phrase, poor in spirit, is translated blessed, or happy, are those who recognize their spiritual need. Because that's the way into the kingdom of heaven. We can't come and make deals with God on our own, because we don't have anything to deal with. We don't have anything that God hasn't given us first. The way into God's kingdom is not to try and clean ourselves up as best we can, brush ourselves off. No. The way into God's kingdom is to admit our mistakes and our faults. Admit how badly we've messed up our lives on our own. Come in and say, "This is me. Here I am. These are my problems. I need help. I can't make it on my own." That's the way into God's kingdom. As we're further along in our Christian walk, if we make a mistake, if we take a fall, the fastest way back on our feet is to admit that mistake and recognize, again, our need for God with the attitude of the poor in spirit. And what happens when we take this attitude? What happens when we're honest with God? When the full realization of how bad we mess things up on our own sinks in, it can be a very sobering experience. As it was for me in those 3 days, those 3 first days in the guerrilla camp. And next, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." If we pay attention to what Jesus says, He really will comfort us. What do we do next? Next he says, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And I had a lot of trouble with that word meek. I thought it meant weak. I thought it meant a wishy-washy, spineless type of personality or lack of personality. Person with a milquetoast mentality, doormat type, who lets everybody get away with murder. I said, I don't want to be like that. So I didn't pay much attention to that verse for quite a while. So I studied it in Spanish. And then I said, hey, that word in Spanish has a different meaning. And I looked it up in my dad's Greek translator's handbook. I found out that the Greek word has no direct translation into English. And it means an attitude of heart and mind of submission to God. In Spanish, the word manso is used in special instances in relationship to horses. And the horse that is manso is the one that allows itself to be guided very easily by the rider, with a very light touch on the reins. It's not a broken-spirited animal at all. It can be high-strung, it can be thoroughbred, it can be a magnificent animal. But if it's manso, it's given up its own plans, and it does what the rider wants instead of what it wants. And that's what faith in Jesus Christ is all about. If we take that meek attitude, place our faith in Jesus Christ to run our life and make the plans, he says we'll inherit the earth. He will totally fulfill and satisfy us in a way that we could never do on our own. Jesus is the only one who can make truly good plans. He's the only one who can see into the future. The only one who can plan and chart our lives past all the obstacles that he can see, but that we can't. What happens when we place our complete faith and confidence and make Jesus Christ the King of our lives? What effect does that have on our lives? Next he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. The Christian life isn't a legalistic list of do's and don'ts. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't dance, don't do this, don't do this. Do come to church, do go to prayer meeting, do tithe, do... No. If we try and do it in our own strength, we'll fail, and we'll just get frustrated. But as we come to Jesus with the right attitude, willing to admit our faults and our failures, willing to put him in charge of our lives, all of a sudden we begin to want to do what God wants. All of a sudden, some of Jesus' thinking spills off into our brain. All of a sudden, we start hungering and thirsting after doing what God wants. We change from the inside out. We say, hey, I'm going to get my act together. I'm going to do it right. I want to please God. That's the motivation of the true Christian. So many times, you find this paradox in Christianity. Is it all by grace? Does God do everything? Do we just sit here and wait for God to supernaturally intervene all the time in our lives and make us into what he wants us to be? If we take that attitude, we may wind up sitting for quite a while. That thing happens sometimes. On the other hand, if we struggle and struggle in our own strength, we'll only get frustrated. As it's impossible for us to live a perfect life on our own. As you see in Jesus' teaching, the order in which he teaches things is very important. Just as important as what he says. And it's not by coincidence that next he says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And I didn't understand that one until one day when I was praying. And I asked God a question in my prayer. I said, I'd really like to know the answer to why I've spent the last 9 years flying in the jungle, over 4,500 hours. Most of the other pilots who've been flying with me in the same time period are now either dead or they've been severely injured or they've been involved in a fatal accident of some sort, or they've quit flying the jungle because it's too dangerous. And I'm not only still alive, but in all these years I've never even scratched an airplane, not even had an incident written up in my logbook. Other pilots, much better qualified than me, made just one little tiny mistake, and that was it. Other missionary pilots, much better Christians than me, made one little tiny mistake, and they got killed. I said to the Lord, you know, why am I being treated so different? What's so special about me? I'm not any better than they are. How come I'm sitting here unscathed? I said, I'd really like to know why I'm being treated so special. And as I meditated, my thinking went back 9 years to before I ever had an airplane. I was sitting out at our farm. We were having trouble with transportation. Someone got sick. It was 19 hours by road to the hospital. One of my friends got sick, and we tried to get an airplane out. The pilot demanded payment before he would make the flight. He was in town, we were out in the jungle. It took a whole day to arrange that, and my friend almost died. I can remember praying to the Lord and saying, if I ever get my hands on an airplane, I'm going to do mercy flights on the basis of whether or not they really need to get done. And I'll not make finances my first consideration. Well, ironically, that very same day, our first airplane arrived. And for 9 years, that's how I ran the flight program. If anybody really needed a flight, we did it for them, regardless of whether or not they could pay. Everybody said, you'll go broke. Airplanes chartered for $300 an hour out in the jungle. You can't give away that many flights and not go broke. But you know, the Lord evened out the finances. We never went broke. And as I was there meditating in prayer, it was almost as if the answer popped into my mind. It was almost as if the Lord put a thought right into my mind. And that thought was, hey, you never turned anyone down who asked you for mercy. And that's why I had mercy on you whenever you needed it. And for a few seconds, I got a glimpse at how God looks on mercy. It's very important to him. He's a God of mercy. That's what it was called when he had mercy on us, when he died on the cross. It's called mercy because we didn't deserve it. We weren't worth saving in the first place. But he did it anyway. So he wants us to turn around and have that same attitude towards all the people that come into contact with us. Jesus said, do unto others as you would have others do unto you, for this is the law of Moses and the prophets. Well, in our ministry and family reconciliation, we found mercy to be the key to reconciliation, to any kind of reconciliation. The first step, we have to give other people the benefit of the doubt in our own minds. When love has been lost in a marriage or in a home or in a relationship, we can't force it back in. We can't decide to love somebody when they're acting in an unlovely manner. But we can decide to have mercy on them in our thinking and in our actions towards them. We found that mercy is the seed of love. When we have mercy on someone else, that mercy doesn't stop with that other person. It goes right on through and back to God. It allows God to have mercy on us. What are the results of a merciful mentality? Next, Jesus said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God face to face. We found that through mercy, We're able to see many marriages and families reconciled. All kinds of problems that the psychologists had given up on. Jesus knew what he was doing. He's the one who made us inside. Jesus has a special term for people who put mercy to work in their lives. Next he said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." So I'd like to challenge you to be a peacemaker. That verse on the wall over there talks about God making us into kings and priests. Revelation 5, 9 and 10. What does a priest do? He gets in between two parties and he mediates. As we become peacemakers, as we allow God's mercy to flow through us, we're able to help heal broken relationships, first between ourselves and those in our immediate family that surround us. Secondly, between other people who are in conflict. But ultimately, our role as a peacemaker should be to bring other people into the knowledge and relationship with Jesus Christ. Shall we pray? Lord Jesus, pray that you would help each one of us to replace any negative thinking that might be in our minds, any thoughts of anger, bitterness, hatred, or resentment, with your mercy instead. Lord Jesus, I pray that your mercy would flow through each one of us and heal the broken relationships wherever they may be. I'd like to claim your promise that you want us to be kings and priests. Lord Jesus, pray that your mercy and love would flow through everyone in this room for your honor and glory. Amen.